Meanwhile, Ontario Premier Doug Ford is making the rounds on U.S. media. Ford is saying if Donald Trump carries through on threatened tariffs, it would cause havoc on both sides of the border. He's urging the president-elect and Americans to consider the consequences. The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick has more on what Ford is saying and his strategy.
Yeah, another round of interviews with U.S. media this week, Andrew, on the heels of other interviews he's done recently on Fox News, for example, and CNBC. Most recently, last night, he appeared on CNN, and he also has been speaking to the New York Times and the Associated Press, a number of outlets. This is all about communicating with Americans. It comes in addition to an ad campaign that Ontario launched a few weeks ago, running ads in Washington, D.C., about the relationship between Ontario and the United States, its economic relationship, its trade relationship. And this is the message Doug Ford has been trying to get across in these interviews as well, talking up the importance of that relationship and how damaged it could be if these tariffs by President-elect Donald Trump go through and are implemented. So he's trying to make the case against the tariffs and for strengthening the trade relationship. But he has been saying in these interviews that if these tariffs are put in place, Ontario will be prepared to fight back and use every tool in its toolbox, is a phrase that Ford likes to use. And by that, one of those tools he's talking about is electricity. And he has talked in various interviews and news conferences about cutting off Ontario's supply of electricity to various U.S. states that it sells it to. Those states mainly are Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. Now, in an interview on CNN last night, that issue came up, but the host pointed out that Ontario's sales of electricity, its supply of electricity to the United States, is a small fraction of its overall power supply. And Aaron Burnett pointing out that the U.S. relies much more heavily on oil from Canada than electricity. So would Canada go so far as to cut off oil supply to the United States? And here's how the Ontario Premier answered that question.
Well, we ship down 4.3 million barrels every single day. If there was a tariff on that, that would increase gas by $1 a gallon. That wouldn't go over very well. And, you know, both sides of the border are going to feel the pain. We rely on each other. Ontario is a big auto province. Yeah. And I want to work with the U.S. I love the American people. I spent 20 years of my life there in Chicago, in our Chicago facility in New Jersey. I love Americans. I love the U.S. And we're so much stronger together.
So when he said we there, Andrew, I think he was sort of talking on behalf of all of Canada, not Ontario in that context, because, of course, Ontario is not shipping the oil to the U.S. Alberta is. And we know that Alberta's Premier, Danielle Smith, is not on the same page as her counterpart here in Ontario in terms of implementing any kind of retaliatory tariffs if the U.S. imposes them on Canada. She has indicated in interviews that she's also been doing with U.S. media that Canada wouldn't win a tariff war with the United States. So she does not want to go that route. So it's interesting to hear Doug Ford answer that question. He kind of pivoted away from it, again, talked about Ontario's manufacturing industry and also talking about his experience in the United States. He was referring to his family business that does business in the United States. And he said in that interview he'd like to sit down with Trump face to face, businessman to businessman, and hash this out. So that's a little bit of what we've been hearing in the most recent interviews, Andrew. He also, in an interview with the Associated Press, brought up the issue of the border in terms of being concerned about Donald Trump's mass deportation plan of illegal migrants in the United States, and if that happens, what impact that could have on a flow of migrants across the Canadian border. He says Ontario will be ready to handle that with police officers being sent to the border, and he meant provincial police officers, the Ontario Provincial Police. So that was another issue he has been raising in interviews. But he did say in terms of the border plan, what was announced by Canada yesterday, and, you know, we're talking a lot about whether it will address the concerns of President-elect Trump and be enough to ward off the tariff threat. Ford is saying he agrees that the border does need to be tightened up and measures do need to be put in place, and that will get done. And again, now he's focused too on communicating to Americans what Canada is doing in an effort to appease the concerns of the Americans and ward off that tariff threat. We know Ford and the other premiers, they want to travel to the United States themselves in February to meet with lawmakers there.
The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick in Toronto. Laura Osman is a federal politics reporter for The Logic, a business and tech news website. She joins me now from Ottawa. And Laura, good to see you. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So what do you think we should make of the fact that the Ontario Premier has emerged as the de facto face of Team Canada? You know, we found it kind of interesting yesterday when we were listening to Dominic LeBlanc, who's been sort of thrust into this finance minister portfolio. He really came out and said, we're very happy that Doug Ford has stepped up to kind of lead some of the response. And he is, to be fair, he is the chair of the Council of the Federation, so the chair of the premiers. So maybe there's something to that in terms of him stepping forward. But it kind of feels as though with all of the political crisis going on in Ottawa, that he's the face of it in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, you might expect to see a federal politician being the one to front some of these interviews and really making the case to Americans that, you know, Canada is a valued trading partner and that major tariffs on U.S. imports from Canada are going to impact the lives of many, many, many Americans. Instead, it's Doug Ford who's making those cases very publicly, you know, on TV stations like CNN and Fox, but also Ontario is running ad campaigns in the U.S. trying to convince everyday Americans that this is bad for them. And so, you know, we're really seeing a contrast here between the federal approach, which has sort of been described with the cliche as like a charm offensive, trying to get in there, make relationships with the Trump administration, make sure that, you know, they can ingratiate themselves with the new members of Trump's inner circle. Whereas we're seeing Doug Ford come out and very publicly talking about these tariffs, talking about the impacts on Americans, including if Ontario were to sort of turn off the lights on parts of Michigan by restricting energy exports to the U.S. And I think it speaks a little bit to a bit of the vacuum here in terms of we're not seeing those federal politicians publicly making this case. And if someone's got to do it, then Doug Ford has agreed to be the guy.
And so remind us what Ontario has to lose here if a 25% tariff came in from Trump.
Well, I mean, the impact would be huge on Canada's economy right across the board. But of course, in Ontario, we have a serious auto sector here that would be seriously impacted by these tariffs. And so politically, this is a matter of survival for Doug Ford as much as it is for anyone. The stakes are really high in Ontario. And so, you know, he's made the point of saying, I only speak for myself. I only speak for my government. But he's been kind of making the case for all provinces. He's not the only one that has something to lose here, but he certainly has a lot to lose.
And we have heard from Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith. She has a bit of a profile in the U.S. She has talked about this as well. She has said she does not want there to be tariffs on oil and gas going from Alberta to the U.S. That's 60% of the U.S. imports oil from mostly Alberta. But it was interesting to see that CNN interview with Doug Ford. He was asked about that, and he mentioned it. Well, it is 4.3 million barrels a day, so that would be a problem, even though Ontario doesn't export any oil, and so he kind of then pivoted away, but saying, you know, I don't want to do that. But so this is where it gets a little bit awkward, right? You've got a premier of one province talking about, you know, oil from another province. That premier has said, we don't want to do this, and then the federal government, this power vacuum. I mean, who would make these kinds of decisions, and who is making these kinds of decisions on what kind of what retaliation could look like?
Well, this is really the problem here is that, you know, we've heard the premiers talk a lot about the need for unity, but who is really corralling these provinces and making sure they have this unified response? You know, Danielle Smith has said no to turning off the taps on oil and gas to the U.S. So we heard Doug Ford kind of make the threat without making it, in that CNN interview. You know, I think he wants to make the point that, like, listen, the impacts could be huge for you, even if it's a last resort for Canada. Danielle Smith doesn't even want to make the threat. Who's to decide what the right path forward is? There's really, we don't seem to have a sense of, who is making this call. Dominic LeBlanc is the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister. He's now chair of the U.S.-Canada Committee as well. And we're just not seeing him have a chance to really take the reins yet as chair of that committee and really start to corral those provinces and get them all on sort of on message the way that they did the last time Trump was in the office.
Do you have a sense, Laura, of who that would have to be? Would it be the federal government? Would it have to be the prime minister saying, and I don't even, never mind the issues that could create between Ottawa and Alberta, but is it, at the end of the day, the federal government that makes that call on perhaps turning off the taps of Alberta oil?
I mean, in a federalized system, it's not really anyone's particular call to tell a province what to do with its own energy resources. And I can only imagine the kind of fights that would break out if the prime minister tried to order that kind of restriction on U.S. on oil exports to the U.S. But I think that really it's about negotiating. It's about diplomacy. It's about getting everyone on side and on message. That would traditionally be the role of the federal government. But given the chaos that's ensuing in Parliament Hill, the disorder that's happening in the Liberal Party and in Cabinet, it really seems to have fallen to Doug Ford as chair of the Federation, which is a council of provincial premiers, to try to do that work and try to get everyone kind of on the same side and saying the same things to our friends in the U.S.
This is a complicated time, Laura, but thanks for coming on and trying to make sense of it all with us. Appreciate this. Laura Osman covers federal politics for The Logic.